From a plant perspective, carbohydrates fall into 3 categories. So simple sugars are active in the plant's metabolism. Secondly, we've got storage compounds, which are our terms of starch and fructans, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And then thirdly, we've got the structural carbohydrates that are cellulose and hemicellulose. Then we look at carbohydrates from a horse's perspective, and when we do this, we classify them by where and how quickly they are digested and absorbed. So in the first instance here, we end up with carbohydrates being digested and absorbed as monosaccharides, primarily in the form of glucose or fructose, and this happens relatively early in the horse's digestive system in the small intestine. Then we actually have the second part of that, which is our fibre, and this gets fermented by microbial fermentation in the hindgut. Now, this also derives energy, and it's actually very, very efficient. It does this by breaking it down to volatile fatty acids. So diving a little bit deeper into that, just because these are all terminologies that we are always using when we talk through, laminitis and PPID and metabolic syndrome and insulin dysregulation. So getting a good handle on this is really, really important. So firstly, those structural carbohydrates, those fibre, slow release type energy compounds. So these are the things that are from the cell walls of the plants. So some of these are more digestible than others. So cellulose, hemicellulose, and those sort of compounds, the microbial fermentation in the hindgut actually derives those volatile fatty acids and can contribute to energy maintenance and body condition in the horse. Then we do have some indigestible compounds as well, and David will touch on this very briefly when we look at hay and pasture analysis in a moment. And this is lignin, and this lignin is something that we do need to consider, and we can use a little bit to our advantage when we get to obese horses, because we actually don't want them to be able to extract a lot of calories out of their food, but we need to give them volume of fibre to keep their digestive system happy. So we'll touch on that a little bit later, and we typically see higher amounts of lignin in stalkier, more mature hays and pastures. So these are really, really important for normal gut function, and your common sources of these sorts of structural carbohydrates, these fibre-based carbohydrates, are pasture, hay, chaff, haylage, and of course our super fibres as well. So super fibres are things like beet pulp, and we'll look at these a little bit later also, particularly for, let's say, a PPID horse that maybe is a little bit on the thinner side because it may have age, may have poor dentition. So we need to look at a different fibre source to work with that horse's digestive system. So beet pulp in itself is actually very effective and very, very well digested in comparison to some other types of hays. They can actually extract a lot more calories out of it. So we also want to be thinking about these types of carbohydrates as typically having a lower glycemic response than the non-structural carbohydrates that we'll go through now. So these, rather than the cell walls, these are the cell components. So common terms that we sort of flick around in this area are starch, glucose, fructans, and sugar. So these are more fast energy or quick energy to some extent. And these are typically absorbed, like I said before, as monosaccharides in the small intestine. They're readily available to be digested, but the horse does not have a great ability to actually do anything with them. So the horse doesn't have a huge amount of amylase production. So this is where we do need to take into consideration meal size as well, because we don't want to overload this part of the horse's digestive system. In the small intestine, lots of things are trying to be absorbed and metabolized there, and anything that's not ends up pushing through into the hindgut and can then actually upset that microbial balance that's responsible for fibre digestion that we were just talking about. So starch is probably the biggest and somewhat scariest word when we have people giving us a call and asking us questions. They're very, very scared of starch and NSC. And this is the primary component of cereal grains. So I've got a few examples there. We're actually going to look at a table in a little while where we'll break this down and really explain to you the significance of this and how we need to look at this as part of the overall ration of the horse. Now, pasture content varies significantly. So depending on pasture species, season, time of day, all of these things really, really change and influence the horses or the amount of NSC and starch being consumed in pasture. And some pasture species store starch better than they do others, and fructans rather than others. So that's certainly something to consider as well, and we'll look at that in a little while. As a very, very general rule, typically something that's higher in starch is a little bit lower in fibre. But like we said before, and we'll look at again in a minute, we really do need to look at those intake rates as they are really, really important for glucose and insulin dynamics. So what exactly is glycemic index and glycemic response? You're going to hear us sort of talk about this a little bit. And this is really the measure of glucose response in the body after a feed. So this is not always mimicked directly by insulin, and it's really dependent upon the level of starch and sugar in the feed, the processing technique that the raw material has undergone, the fat content of the ration, and of course the rate of intake. So something that is high in sugar and starch is typically classified as something a bit higher GI, and something high in fat and fibre is lower GI. But we still do need to consider the amount of feed that's going into the horse's digestive system in one go. So this little graph here is just a glycemic response to a high grain meal. So you can see the time of feeding, and then you can actually see, up to three hours after consuming the food, you can actually see what was happening in the horse. So you can see how glucose and insulin is peaking. And when we get to talking about insulin in a little bit more in depth in a moment, and the problems that can cause with these metabolic horses, you'll understand a little bit more about the significance of this. This is an example of one with a sweet feed, then a sweet feed and an oil, so a fat source, and then just a hay. So you can actually see that the sweet feed or the grain-based feed with some of those cereal grains and these non-structural carbohydrates really does have a big impact on glycemic response, which is why we tend to recommend steering clear as much as possible of some of the grains for horses with metabolic conditions. Now, I'm going to flick back to David a little bit as well, because the most important thing here is that forage does remain the foundation of the diet, even with these PPID metabolic type horses. But we need to look at if pasture and hay is actually possible for these horses. So David, if you want to take us through the next few slides.
Yep, sure. And when we're looking at what we're going to feed these challenged horses, we also generally will have other horses on the property as well. So obviously sometimes it's not the ideal situation, but we really need to know exactly what's occurring on our farm. So why do we test pasture or hay? Because it could be up to 100% of the diet, and in most cases, it's going to be a large proportion of the diet. As Rebecca said, pasture constantly is changing, and it could change from season to season, area to area, but even within an hour. And I remember some research done when I first started, and they looked at when the clouds went over a certain pasture, and it changed the sugar levels purely because of cloud cover. So it's amazing how adaptive the plants are with the photosynthesis cycle. Obviously, pasture is essential to provide accurate information to us when we formulate diets. Custom rations, especially for these horses suffering from metabolic issues. And it gives us that idea of customer reliance. So where do we test our pasture? We've had a relationship with Dairy One in New York. Part of the company is called Equi-Analytical. So we have some fantastic calibrations there that enable us to provide really accurate results. And since they've been looking at equine pastures for decades, they're really narrowed down on what's important to us. So as we'll talk in a minute, we're narrowing down the sugar fractions, which enable us to provide quite a detailed service. If you're unable to use Dairy One, consistency is key if you're monitoring the sugar levels and the nutrient levels in your hay or your pasture. So choose one lab, because calibrations between labs and analysis may vary. So when do we do this? Each season's different. So mid-season sampling gives us a best estimate. And remember before when I said that everything can vary greatly, this is a best guess. This is not a definitive answer. So it's just a single point in time. So if we're sampling larger areas, if you have lots of horses, which have various different pastures or soil types of fertilizers, I'd manage group sampling them accordingly. If we're a small farm, I'd look at what we're doing, and especially if you have a metabolic issue horse, the small amount that it does cost to actually test your hay or your pasture, it will save you a lot of grief in the long run. So it's just a small investment in your horse's health. What we've found a lot now is, as the fodder industry in Australia has got more mature, we're seeing lots of hay being sold with feed tests, and many produce stores around the country now are actually selling their hay with feed tests. So what does the analysis say? So often you'll see on a pasture analysis like we see here, or actually a feed analysis, we'll have moisture and we'll have dry matter. So, and these will obviously vary because the moisture of pasture can range from up to over 80% moisture in spring, or at the moment in some parts of New South Wales in the Hunter, it's fantastic right now, down to 10% moisture when it's quite dry. So really what we are looking at is our dry matter intake, because let's just assume that the moisture, that's water that the horses are going to eat instead of drink. So we always really need to look at what the dry matter intake of a horse is. So how do we read a test? Obviously, we've heard of crude protein. How we analyze that is we base it off the nitrogen level. We times it by 6.25. There's a couple of different ways that we can determine our fat level, and this will vary greatly with our pastures or our hay. We'll also see equine digestible energy, which Beck will talk a little bit further on before. The equations that Dairy One use are derived from Dr. Joe Pagan, who's the founder of Kentucky Equine Research. So they're quite specific with regards to digestibilities, and they're very equine specific. You'll also see fibre fractions, NDF, or it may appear on the results or analyst page as ANDF. What that does, it contains cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, but not pectin, which is the more softer fibre fractions. And then we have ADF, which is cellulose and lignin. And then sometimes on the results we have lignin, which is our indigestible portion of our diet. So pasture and hay quality, there's basic guidelines exist for what's appropriate NDF and ADF, and you can sort of tell the quality of hay. An old guideline was a simple grab test. If you grab it and it's nice and soft, it's very digestible. If you grab it and it hurts your hand, it's quite indigestible. So when you're looking at high quality digestible hay for some horses, the softer hay is going to be better. If you've got the drier stalky, that may be better in this case. For basic quality, I'll go back up, please. NDF content around 40 to 50% and 30 to 35% is considered ideal for performance horses, young stock and broodmares. So it's a high quality pasture or hay. Mature horses at maintenance and easy keepers might benefit of hay with slightly higher levels. Hays with higher NDFs and ADFs of 65, 45, they will have little nutritional value, but these can be excellent choices for metabolic or horses with metabolic issues and obesity. So some of the other structures that we'll be talking about are the carbohydrates, and Rebecca will be referring to these quite a lot, are NSE, which is non-structural carbohydrates. So how we calculate these is starch plus sugars. Then we have starch, which is our complex carbohydrates. You would have heard of WSC or water-soluble carbohydrates. So these are simple sugars and fructans. Then we have ESC, which is ethanol-soluble carbohydrates. These are a subset of the water-soluble, and these are just simple sugars. So a quick equation, if you want to actually derive what the fructan level of your pasture or hay is WSC minus ESC, and that'll give you a guide there. So how do we interpret and implement these tests? It gives us a guideline of what nutrients are going to go into our horse if they have free range to pasture. Generally, intake of a horse that's allowed free access, it's going to be anywhere from 450 grams to 900 grams of dry matter pasture intake per hour. When we're associating the diets, we'll pair this with supplementation. For us at KR, we'll use the microsteed evaluation programs and examine the total intake. And is it balanced? And is it balanced for these specific horses, which Rebecca will go into more detail. So this is a potential for us to consult to our customer and alter the diet or the product, determining what forage is being fed to the horse.
Perfect. So, I mean, I certainly think that's one of the most common questions that we get asked, or at least we see people trying to figure out on some of these social media forums and the like. So once we've gone through that, and obviously we would advocate for you to get that hay and that pasture actually tested, because then you know what you're dealing with straight up. So once you know if it's suitable, you can make a determination on where to go to from here. So at this point, you need to consider the horse's age and their disease status. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure if it's an older horse, you know, how is their dental health? Are they able to chew this long-stemmed forage? Or do we need to be looking at some alternative forage sources like our beet pulp for them? We also need to look at the horse's body condition score, because that will help us determine the type of hay or additional forage that we want. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And also we need to look at that status of insulin dysregulation, and that will help us eliminate some of these potential alternative fibre sources straight off the bat. So if the horse has good dentition, and we're going to be looking towards hay as our fibre source, if we've got to take them off pasture, or if the pasture is not suitable, then obviously there's lots of different options. And depending upon where you are in the country, it's going to be very variable. So grass hays, you know, what really is grass hay? There is a huge variance in the non-structural carbohydrate content of grass hay. It can be very low, or it can be quite high, depending on the species when it was cut in environmental conditions around that time. You can also, in this instance, look towards lucerne hay. So some of our legume type hays are typically a little bit lower in NSC and sugar content than a grass hay, but they do have a higher digestible energy content, which may make them unsuitable if we look back towards our body condition score situation and the horse is overweight and we're trying to facilitate weight loss, then lucerne hay may not be the best option, because the horse will just be able to derive too many calories and inhibit that process a little bit. Our cereal type hays, like our oaten hay, is certainly in most cases not that advantageous for these metabolic horses because it can be quite high in NSC. And TEF hay's sort of come onto the market relatively recently in the last few years, and there's a few things that you do need to be aware of. It's not always low NSC, and that's one caution that I would put out there. I would still encourage you to have it tested or to buy hay that has been tested rather than just trusting it's TEF, so it must be fine. We also need to consider the implications of how we're going to be feeding this to our horses and the management things that we can actually deal with. You know, in that little questionnaire you guys just filled out, I noticed that quite a lot of you do give your horse, I think it was 20% of you do have your horses with access to a round bale. Now, that would be fine in some instances for, let's say, a Cushing's horse that is not overweight and maybe doesn't have any issues with insulin dysregulation. However, for a horse that we're trying to maybe reduce some weight on, or for horses that we need to trickle feed because we really want to spread that that insulin stress out over a longer period of time and not just have them consuming in one big amount, that could be problematic. So square bales might be the better way to go here. 100% of the time, we would advocate to use slow feeders or hay nets of some description. Not only will it reduce waste for you and save you a bit of money rather than them sort of sleeping in their hay and soiling it, but it will also slow that consumption down, which is advantageous, and reduce contamination from the ground, not only from a worm point of view, but mud in winter and sand and dirt in summer. Haylage is another option that you can potentially look at, which can be advantageous in some of these instances. Chaff may or may not be used. You know, some people have a very definitive preference for or against chaff. Certainly you can use it to slow down the horse's intake of a ration, which may be advantageous for some of these horses. And then, of course, we've got our digestible fibre sources like beet pulp. So for an older horse that's got poor dentition that needs to gain weight, this would be perfectly placed for that. So we do need to look at then selecting feeds for energy and nutrients. So if we get to the point where we are giving our horse access to enough forage to keep them happy and healthy, 1.5% certainly is not, we don't want to go too far below that of their body weight. We then need to look to alternative feed sources. So one thing that I would be very cautious of doing is looking at the ingredients list. It is really, really important to look at it, but it's also not the be all and end all. You need to look at it in the grand scheme of things, and we'll look at a little table in a minute that will help you do that. Certainly, we don't want to be feeding necessarily a big sweet feed, but just because something might have a small amount, 1 or 2% of molasses in it, that is not the end of the world and does not mean you need to necessarily strike it off the list. It just means that you need to look at it as part of your overall management strategy for your horse and for that horse's individual condition. Certainly look at the nutritional analysis as well as the feeding rate. So you've got to take both into consideration, and I'll show you that in a moment. And the management strategy of how frequently you can actually feed this to the horse. So can you feed something 3 or 4 times a day, or is it a once a day sort of situation? So a lot of people, when they are dealing with these horses that are not obese and that they maybe need to either fuel for performance or give calories to for breeding purposes, or that because they're underweight or we're just trying to maintain weight in an older horse, we tend to look towards fat a little bit. And this can be useful because it can get more calories into the horse on a gram by gram basis in comparison to carbohydrates. So it can actually help us to reduce meal volume, and that can be certainly advantageous, but you can go too far because there's been some research done, some with Kentucky Equine Research and some independent of Kentucky Equine Research, where horses fed high fat rations compared to a moderate NSC diet actually had reduced insulin sensitivity. So we do need to be careful, and we do need to look at it as part of an overall feeding plan and not get too hung up on one or two things. So this table here looks very confusing, and it's not meant to be, but it is really, really important because we need to look at how much NSC is actually contributing to the diet as a whole. Now, it's kind of universally accepted that for a lot of these metabolic syndrome type horses, we want that to sit around the 10 to 12%. Now, we do, like David explained before, we look at starch plus WSC, okay, and that gives us the NSC content, okay. We also then need to look at the typical feeding rate, or the feeding rate, the inclusion rate that we want to put that into the horse's ration, and then we times that, and we actually look at the amount of NSC that is being contributed to the diet overall. So I'm just going to draw your conclusion or draw your attention to a couple of things here before we draw the conclusions. Now, in the blue box here, I've just picked the example of a ryegrass pasture fed at 7.5% of, 7.5 kilos of intake per day. That will yield around 900 grams of NSC. Then we actually look down the table to the other blue box there, which we've got a moderate NSC fully fortified feed that we're going to be feeding at 3 kilos, and that is going to yield 600 grams per day. So you can see that we're feeding less than half the quantity or the kilo amount, but we're achieving way more than 50% of the same amount of NSC per day. So if we were feeding this to a horse, this horse would be receiving 1,500 grams of NSC per day as an overall ration. This would be split across, obviously, not one feed, across a couple of feeds. Then the next thing that we look at here is we look at a grain, for instance. Now, there's just a couple here. Obviously, you could do this with every conceivable ingredient, but we've just picked a few of the common ones here. Now, if you were just feeding 2 kilos of corn, you would actually arrive at the same total amount of NSC in the ration, give or take a few grams, without any forage at all. So if you then added that same ryegrass pasture in, you would end up with obviously about 2.5 or 2,400 grams per day, which is substantially higher than that of a moderate NSC feed. Now, the other thing to consider here as well is the difference between individual ingredients, and processing technique, and all of those things that we briefly mentioned before certainly does come into play, because you can feed sort of, these are average numbers obviously, but you can feed approximately 3 kilos of whole oats to get to around that 1,400 grams per day mark. And you can only feed about 2 kilos of our steam flaked corn to achieve about the same. So you really do need to look at the amount of inclusion rate in the ration, not just a specific ingredient within that ration. The last thing to draw your attention to on this particular chart is looking at that fully fortified feed, the top one with the red box around it, where we're feeding it. It's a moderate NSC product at that 3 kilos a day. You know, we are yielding that 600 grams a day. But then we can actually have a balancer pellet, which has almost exactly the same NSC content, that is only a third of the actual NSC content because we're feeding it at a third of the rate. Okay, a balancer pellet is a concentrated source of nutrients, which usually includes protein, vitamins, and minerals for those horses that are doing well maintaining their body condition on forage alone, but we do need to supply those additional vitamins, minerals, and protein for, you know, work or breeding or just normal body maintenance. So I guess the general conclusion to come out of this slide here is that you do need to look at starch, NSC, so starch plus WSC, NSC in total, in conjunction with your feeding rate, and then add it up on top of every single thing that you are actually putting into that ration. So now we're going to start to dive down into some of the metabolic syndromes that you guys have identified that you've actually got. So the vast majority of you said in that little poll that you're dealing with horses with laminitis and metabolic syndrome, or EMS, and that you're really quite unsure about how to create a diet and really worried about preventing recurrence of laminitis with these concurrent conditions. So really, when we look at different types of laminitis, there are many, okay? We can have a dietary overload, you know, the pony gets into the feed room sort of situation. We can have our weight-bearing or concussive type laminitises, endotoxemics from retained placenta and things like that. But really, we are not looking at those ones this evening. We're really focusing on the endocrinopathic type, where we are relating to a metabolic disease. And in terms of these horses, there's some nice data now from the US and the UK that have done some studies that are sort of thinking around that 90% of all laminitis is actually this most dominant form, this hormonal, this endocrinopathic laminitis. And this is something that's really very different to what we were saying 5 to 10 years ago. We weren't even talking about this. This was the exception. This was the odd case of laminitis. And now it's very much the majority of laminitis cases that you're going to see and that you're going to deal with. And one of the things to really consider is, you know, two horses on the same pasture. You know, in reality, a lot of us do have multiple horses, and, you know, one might be a paddock companion or a pony or a retired horse. One might be a off-the-track thoroughbred, just for instance. And you can have two horses grazing on the same pasture with a different metabolism or different underlying factors, and one will be affected by these problems and the other one may not be. So this slide here looks awfully scary, but it's really not meant to be. It's just to draw your eye to the fact that we are going to be talking about this endocrinopathic laminitis, and with laminitis sitting there in the center, everything it's coming from this insulin dysregulation, this hyperinsulinemia situation. But what actually causes that? And we need to work our way backwards here and figure out what's causing the problem that's causing the laminitis. And there's lots of different factors. So, you know, there's that high NSC content, there's PPID, or equine Cushing's disease, as a lot of people commonly refer to it as. Then we've got over on the other side here, our equine metabolic syndrome type influence factors, where we do have a genetic component or a breed predisposition. We've got body fat or adiposity, so a horse with a high body condition score, and horses that are not completing adequate exercise. And we know that exercise is really, really important in insulin and glucose dynamics in the body. So horses that do have PPID or EMS do have an increased risk of laminitis. And, you know, there's a couple of studies that have given us an indication of just how much more likely they are to develop these. And for PPID, we're looking at sort of that 4 to 5 times the risk. And that was some work done by Kathy McGowan quite a few years ago now. And the same with EMS, where we're looking at up to sort of 30 times the risk factor for developing laminitis. So it is a very, very real worry for horse owners that do deal with these horses. Now you'll see there I've put 3 little green stars on this particular diagram, and the reason I've done that they are the 3 things that we can actually influence through management. So these are the things that we need to spend some time talking about and that we really need to understand the importance of, so that we can influence this insulin dysregulation / consistent hyperinsulinemia and hopefully stop the progression through to laminitis. So what is insulin dysregulation and hyperinsulinemia? You know, they're very big, scary words, but really the hormone insulin is secreted systematically from an organ called the pancreas in response to elevated blood glucose, and is used to control blood glucose concentrations in the blood and glucose utilization within the body itself. So insulin communicates with cells via different receptors to facilitate this movement of glucose into, or facilitate glucose uptake into the cells. Now, insulin dysregulation just refers to any abnormality in insulin metabolism in response to a normal process like eating. And insulin is released from, in response rather, to circulating glucose, which have been absorbed from the digestive tract and stimulate these receptors on the membranes of those pancreatic cells called beta cells. And these then release insulin in response to this stimulation. Now, there are certain hormones that also accelerate insulin secretion from the pancreas. So hormone imbalances can certainly affect secretion as well. But in terms of insulin resistance, this is referring to the cells when they become less sensitive to that insulin. So they are resulting in an impaired glucose uptake. We're seeing an increase in release of glucose from the liver. We're seeing an increase in the levels of fatty acids in the blood as well. And when it comes to, and when cells become resistant to this insulin, more insulin is then secreted in order to achieve the same effect and keep that blood glucose concentration within its normal limit, or try to keep it within its normal limit. And in really severe cases, this insulin becomes ineffective at clearing this glucose from the blood, and the glucose remains really, really high. And this is what we then term hyperinsulinemia. And this prolonged hyperinsulinemia then influences long-term health and has a role to play, like we've just looked at, in laminitis. So because horses are designed to be continuously sort of grazing, this sort of 16 to 20 hours roughly per day, whether that is on pasture or whether that is on hay, if we've had to remove them off pasture, it means that they are likely to be needing to secrete this insulin continuously. And this is why diet is a really, really critical part of actually managing horses with equine metabolic syndrome, with insulin dysregulation, and with PPID, with concurrent insulin dysregulation. So one thing that there is some data on is the use of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids to improve glucose transport. Now, EPA and DHA have been shown to have some anti-obesity type effects, and these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which are derived directly in their most biologically active form from fish oil, can improve insulin sensitivity in some species, including exercised horses. So exercise goes hand in hand with nutritional management of all of these conditions, as much as we can. Obviously, if the horse is not sound with acute laminitis, we're not going to be working it until it is appropriate to do so. But we do need to remember that fish oil can moderate that glucose response in horses, and has also been shown to have an impact on increasing insulin sensitivity in insulin-resistant mares, so in breeding stock, and in aged horses that were fed a high-fat diet. So EPA and DHA are the most potent forms of anti-inflammatory polyunsaturated fatty acids. And in human studies, they've been shown to be around 9 to 10 times as potent as delivering them in the ALA form, which is the form that they get delivered in as flaxseed or linseed. So this sort of mimics in horses that horses don't seem to be very efficient at converting this ALA in linseed into EPA and DHA. So particularly for horses with glucose problems, you'd be wanting to deliver this as EPA and DHA as a fish oil, because that's really, really the best way to get the best result, delivering it to the horse in the way that you actually need to have it. So there have been multiple studies, both within KER and researchers at Colorado State University and the University of Florida, that have demonstrated fish oil to incorporate into red blood cell membranes at a faster rate and more effectively than they will when it's applied as ALA or linseed. So you don't need to be worried about, even for a very overweight horse, we're looking at 30 mils of EO3, which is a KER product. That's not deriving many calories at all. So you can certainly still be giving it and not compromising the effort of weight loss. So moving along as well, looking at PPID, current estimates suggest that approximately a third of horses are going to develop PPID by the age of 20. So that's a lot of horses, given that we do have certainly an aging population. Now, PPID, in a study done once again by Kathy McGowan on randomly selected horses. So these were not necessarily perfect candidates for PPID. They were randomly selected, and it showed that horses of 15 years and over, about 21% of them were diagnosed with PPID, whether they had overt clinical symptoms or not. So with PPID, we've moved a long way from the original, the horse has a long, shaggy, non-shedding coat, so it must have PPID, to actually looking at some of the earlier symptoms, where we can look at some of this decreased athleticism, poor performance, changes in top line and a bit of a body fat, a bit of a belly, pot belly, slight increases in polydipsia, so the increase in water intake, polyuria, so the urine output, losses in appetite, and changes in metabolism. We now can really look at those early signs, and horses that are having laminitic issues, and actually look at testing them when we go out and we look at them for laminitis, or when we have somebody come out and see our horse because it has laminitis, actually looking at why this horse has developed it in the first place. Is PPID an underlying issue, which allows us to get onto the problem perhaps a little bit earlier and understanding what we can be doing, so we can look at this treatment plan either in the initial stages and then going for long-term care as well. Now, metabolic syndrome is the other one that we need to just briefly sort of define. And this is a bit tricky because it's really a collection of risk factors that are highly associated with this endocrinopathic laminitis. So adiposity or body fat is a very, very common link, particularly a crusty neck and some abnormal fat deposits over the horse. Obviously, very, very good doers and breed predisposition comes into play here. And just thinking about that diagram that we just looked at with the three things down the side, we did have breed predisposition and body condition score and exercise as really, really key factors to looking at for metabolic syndrome. Now, we can we can control 2 of those. We can't do anything about the breed predisposition per se, but we can certainly manage body condition, and we can certainly make sure horses are getting adequate and appropriate exercise. So these horses do have a high risk of laminitis due to that hyperinsulinemia, which you saw in that diagram as well. And this can coexist with PPID or equine Cushing's disease. So we know that EMS results from this interaction between these genetic factors, so breed predisposition, and these environmental factors that we can control. And there's very individual. So like we said before, some horses will be affected, other horses will not, and they may be managed in exactly the same way. So there's certainly a high genetic risk for some animals over others, but particularly those that then go on to have high diets high in non-structural carbohydrates, it is a risk factor for sure. So always prevention is better than cure. You know, I was always going to have to say that tagline sometime in this talk, and really being proactive is very, very much the key here. So feeding energy to achieve a desirable body condition score with insulin dysregulation status in mind. So everyone should be able to body condition score a horse. There's 4 or 5 places that we look over, but we don't look at any of these places individually. Because, you know, if we just look at the crest, for instance, some breeds, some of our Spanish type breeds, like Andalusians, they do have a crest. That is natural for them. Stallions obviously have a crest as well. So we can't just look at the neck and go, oh yes, it's a bit cresty. It must have insulin dysregulation, or it must have EMS. We do need to look over the ribs. So you should be able to run your hand down the side of the horse, feeling those ribs, not having to apply too much pressure to feel them. But once again, we need to do this in conjunction with all of these other spaces. So over the backbone as well is really, really important, because when we get to an older horse, for instance, maybe a horse that's in its mid-20s, or a mare that's been a brood mare, it's not uncommon for them to have a bit more of a saggy belly, be a little bit more lean over the ribs, but have a little bit of tenting going on over the spine, and that's just a result sometimes of their age. It can be indicative of a horse being underweight, but not by itself. We need to look at it overall. Certainly if you are looking along the backbone and you're seeing a little bit of a dip, you know, that's not ideal. So that tells you the horse is probably carrying a little bit more condition than what he or she should. And certainly around fat around the top of the tail head is indicative sometimes of problems going on here. Now, there are 2 sort of universally accepted body condition score systems. The Australian score, which is the one on the screen there, which is the 1 to 5 or 0 to 5 scale. And then we've also got the US or the Henneke system, which is a 1 to 9. Now, whichever one you actually use the same one consistently. And if you're a little bit inexperienced in managing a horse's body weight, or if you're trying to achieve either weight gain or weight loss, it's probably a good idea to make a little bit of a diary, a photo diary, at regular intervals. It's hard when we see these horses every single day to notice these changes, but when you look back at them over a couple of weeks, it's a lot easier to do. Equally, if you're managing a large number of horses or multiple horses, doing it is useful, or if you've got multiple people managing the same horse, because then you can all look at that on a very even scale, and you take the individuality out of it a little bit. So managing against weight gain or trying to achieve weight loss. So we don't, you know, we're looking at our first thing that we can really manage here from that diagram that I showed you before. Now, exercise is really, really important. Prevention is better than cure, of course, but if we've already gone down this path and we're starting to have some problems, exercise is very, very useful. Reducing caloric intake is also really important. and making sure that we still feed adequate forage. It still needs to form the majority of our ration, and then feeding a vitamin and mineral supplement which doesn't contain calories. You know, do not go and starve the horse. Do not lock it up with nothing to eat, because we do need to keep gut health in mind as well. We also need to aim for steady, consistent, achievable weight loss. So monitor this body condition score, look at the fat deposits and the girth, and consider using a grazing muzzle. It's very tempting for us to pull horses off pasture and lock them up into a yard, because then we can really control everything that we feed. However, we actually reduce the amount of exercise and calories that the horse is using by doing that, because they're no longer walking around. Certainly soak your forages and consider what else is going on. So, you know, laminitis, PPID, anything else you need to consider at the same time in conjunction with that horse's age. So we do want to increase this energy output. So if possible, keep them in a paddock with a grazing muzzle on. They'll exercise themselves. If we can't do that for whatever reason, then we need to do this forced exercise regime. So, you know, as long as they're not lame and sore, then we need to do exercise with them, whether it's hand walking, lunging, riding, whatever we can possibly do. So there are lots of benefits to having this grazing muzzle. If you can facilitate that, you know, we know that it will reduce dry matter intake by 83%, and it does reduce over a 24-hour period as well. But it does depend on the design, the grass type, and you just want to make sure that that horse is able to drink and used to drinking with these grazing muzzles on as well. We've got to be really practical, and that they are going to safely keep them on. You know, a lot of these horses are very good at getting out of them, and if we leave them in a paddock where they then all of a sudden have access to forage, that can be a little bit disastrous. So reducing obesity does increase insulin sensitivity, and this is really, really important. So we want to determine what body condition we want to achieve to begin with. Then we look at stripping the diet back. So we still do 1 to 1.5% of body weight in forage, in dry matter intake. And we aim for about 5% of body weight loss over 4 to 6 weeks. So they may lose in their girth measurement, but may not lose in their overall body condition score. So this is where keeping a bit of a photo log can be really, really important. At this time, it is really important to maintain protein, vitamin, and mineral levels in the horse, because they are still needing to, you know, they've still got body to maintain. And if they've actually got a disease, their metabolic, or if they're unwell, their metabolic rate might be quite high. So we don't want to strip those things out of them. We do need to supply that, but supply it in the form of a balancer pellet or supplement that's going to contribute pretty much no calories into the ration. So in the first week, you're likely to see them lose some gut fill because you're starting to restrict that free access to forage. But like I said before, you've got to look at it overall on a continual basis. Now, in terms of pasture, we need to be careful of both the amount of calories that the horse is deriving from pasture, as well as the carbohydrate or non-structural carbohydrate content of that pasture. So we know that horses can consume up to 40% of their dry matter intake needs within 3 hours, and up to 12% in 12 hours. So even for those of you that said, now how many of you were there? 25% of you were actually giving your horses sporadic access, so a couple of hours of access to pasture a day, and the rest of the time you had them off that. You know, they're probably actually consuming quite a lot of calories during that time, and because they're consuming that in a very short period, they're actually creating quite an insulin demand on the body during that sort of peak time. Some horses won't be able to have access to pasture, so we do need to be able to work around them. And it can be risky at certain times of the year. So we do need to take into consideration pasture length, and growth of the pasture as well. If we can strip graze, if we can cross graze with other stock as well, it can be beneficial. Considering the pasture species, and like David said, it's going to be different if you've got sun on one side of the hill and cloud on the other side of the hill. But certainly autumn and spring can be high risk periods for these types of horses. Natural sugars are typically lower in the morning. So if you are going to let the horse out for a couple of hours, this is typically the best time to do it, and have them off the pasture by sort of 9 or 10 a.m. Not always very convenient for us, but that is the safest time to allow them to do that. The exception to that would be following a frost. Then you certainly wouldn't be wanting to have horses necessarily on it, because fructan levels can be quite high, and you do need to look at, if there's seed head on the pasture, and how much sunshine has been on that pasture on the previous day. Soaking your hay or steaming your hay, and also slowing intake is really, really critical. We know that it reduces up to 40% of non-structural carbohydrates and up to 7% reduction in digestible energy content of the hay. And usually what we recommend is around 30 minutes for cold water and 60 minutes for cold water, 30 minutes for warm water. Make sure that it's soaked, fully submerged, and then actually bring it out of the water and throw that water away. Let the hay drip dry before you give it to the horse, because we do know that that's where all the sugar is now. So we don't want that horse to have access to that. So really the practical approach to looking at these horses with metabolic conditions is, looking at digestible energy requirements. What we've just been through, looking at forage and fibre first, assess what you've got on the ground, make the most of it if you can. If you can't, decide on an alternative forage source which is safe. Assess body condition score, and then you can make a decision if you need to add additional calories or just balance the supplement with a vitamin and mineral, and then monitor it and reevaluate it. You've got to continuously do this all the time. For horses with laminitis, you do need to look at and recognise obesity, that it is a pro-inflammatory state, and that dietary and pasture triggers are very, very risky in these horses. We've just been through some of those statistics. Exercise is really important when you can do so, and hoof care is really important as well, because hoof health actually changes at a cellular level. So it's hard to improve once the cell is already in place, and it's a bit of a long, slow burn. So if you are having to reshape hooves and work with feet, potentially considering a hoof supplement can be quite advantageous. Now, we know that these laminae do have a reduced antioxidant capacity compared to some other tissues in the body, and that given that obesity is a pro-inflammatory state, and reduced blood flow can lead to a reduction, lead to increased free radicals, oxidative stress is a very real risk. So supplementing horses with vitamin E is probably the most advisable antioxidant to be supplementing them with, and also considering those long-chain omega-3 fatty acids coming from fish oil, because they're going to have the most potent anti-inflammatory type effect. So at the initial onset of this laminitis, when we're very, very stressed, we do want to remove this dietary risk factor if there is one at play here. Whether it's pasture, grain, do we need to alter the feed? Maybe we do. Like I said before, don't starve them. We can manage obesity, but we need to do that on a slow, gradual level. We need to supply energy and protein needs for maintenance and repair of tissues. Lucerne is absolutely fine in this instance, even if the horse is a little overweight, just to begin with, because it is typically, like we said earlier, a little lower in NSC, and the horse is in pain, which can then cause some inappetence. And if we're trying to give them some supplements or medication, we do need them eating. So lucerne may be a really good carrier for that. and including these antioxidants, particularly something like nano-E, which we do see an increase in changes in serum vitamin E levels within 12 hours. And it is the fastest uptake on the market. So something that can be very strategically used when we need it sort of most. Looking at long-term or more of the general feeding strategy for these types of horses, we are going to try and steer clear of these grain and sweet feed options. However, don't be 100% frightened if you see a grain byproduct or mill run or something like that on an ingredients list of a premixed feed or of a supplement. A lot of balancer pellets will use that, and that's okay, because remember, we've got a very, very small intake rate, maybe a kilo, maybe less. So it's contributing a very small amount to the overall intake, and in all likelihood, your hay or forage source, even with it being soaked, is still going to be contributing more than that. You may be able to allow pasture access, but using things like a grazing muzzle is certainly a good thing. And horses should be able to be in that paddock if possible, so they can exercise and improve that insulin sensitivity. So really do consider that. Sticking to this 10 to 12% non-structural carbohydrate of the overall diet is good. Looking at your tested feed sources, and certainly testing it and soaking it. Perhaps a mature grass hay, so something with that stalkier stem like we referred to earlier on, is going to be a little bit more indigestible. So the horse is going to extract less calories, but we're going to be able to give it at that safe 1% of body weight rate to maintain gut health. Slow the horse down, so small whole hay nets are really, really useful. Really no treats, and yes, I have written that in capitals because it is just the temptation. We still love to give our horse treats, but I would encourage you to use a pelleted vitamin and mineral supplement, for instance, instead, and give that as a treat. The horse will still love you. There are some supplements such as chromium and psyllium, which may be useful. Some of the first research that was done on chromium was actually done at Kentucky Equine Research. It wasn't done on obese horses, it was done on mature non-obese horses that were being exercised, but it did show an improved glucose and insulin dynamics following a meal and in conjunction with exercise. So it is something definitely to consider. Fish oil, as we looked at before, antioxidants, and potentially hoof supplements. I mean, this is, if you want to throw everything at it. In terms of a dietary strategy, these are all things that we've already looked at, but for a non-obese horse, beet pulp is a great option. It's got a lot of calories in it. And it's a safe fibre-based, highly digestible fibre source, which is going to deliver those calories in a safe way. Rice bran is also useful, and you can see some starch levels there in comparison to other options. And a stabilised rice bran such as Equajoule, if you're in the Australian market, is certainly can be safe when we look at the overall diet of the horse. But I would suggest that you get some help in putting all of those equations together, just so you make sure you've got it all right and don't try to do it all yourself. So when we look at PPID, obviously all of these instances we are working with our veterinarian as well. So we do need to consider that, but horses with PPID may go on to pergolide, which is a medication, and we do need to consider that. We also need to be aware that pasture can be high in NSC at some times of the year, particularly at this time of the year, so in autumn, and then again in spring. So lush, actively growing, abundant pasture, but also short drought-affected stressed pasture can cause problems. So talking it through with somebody and having a diet consult one-on-one is definitely advisable. The non-structural content of the pasture does vary throughout the day as well, remember, so we do need to just keep that in mind. Balance the diet, look at the horse's body condition, We do advocate for higher antioxidant intakes with horses with PPID because they can be slightly immune compromised. So vitamin E, once again, can be very, very useful in this instance. So you'll notice this slide here is pretty much exactly the same as the one that we've just been through with laminitis, because we do manage these horses in a very similar way when they are overweight. But thin horses with PPID can pose a little bit of a challenge for us when we do have a horse with insulin dysregulation as well. And these horses can be tricky because sometimes we have some appetite loss, which is associated with medication. So one of the side effects of pergolide can actually be some inappetence. So keeping a handle on that is really, really important. Considering dental health, so bearing in mind a lot of these horses are older, are we giving them a roughage source that they can actually do something with? For underweight horses with PPID, deriving calories from a fat or fibre source rather than starch is certainly the way to go, because it will have less of an impact on insulin and glucose dynamics. There's lots and lots of feeds that are available on the market, but the key, like we said before, is to look at the diet overall, because we just want to make sure that we select something that is appropriate. And just as this little graph here shows, sometimes a senior feed, even though some of these horses might be senior, may not be the most appropriate. And they may have a comparative glycemic index along with oats or another sweet feed because they might have a little bit more molasses for palatability or other things in the diet there. So, softer hays as well, like lucerne, super fibers, once again, can be useful. Fat, vegetable oil has been shown to reduce glycemic response. So like we said before, just use it within reason, because the more fat or oil we do add into a ration, potentially we can create more oxidative stress. So we do want to offset that once again with an antioxidant such as vitamin E. Feeding these non-obese PPID horses, we still want to break the meal size down. That's really, really important, because we want to spread this out over a long period of time. We don't want to be giving them one big meal a day. And this can be a challenge in terms of practical management if we can only get to horses once a day or twice a day and they need a fair bit of feed to keep them going. So that's where I would certainly advocate you getting in touch with a nutritionist and then helping you through your individual situation. So I guess the take-home points here are, that we do have this individual approach that we need to consider. There are so many factors. This is just a tiny little snapshot of what needs to be considered. And always base your ration off forage. We still need that for the horse's gut health, and we still need to be working with that, get it tested, see what you've got, and then go from there. Take the guesswork out, then look towards what other things you need to have in the diet to care for that horse's body condition. Be really, really proactive rather than reactive. Consider looking at underlying causes when horses do develop laminitis. They may not look like they've got Cushing's or may not look like they've got some of these other conditions, but we maybe need to do some further diagnostics in conjunction with our veterinarian. Exercise is really, really important and cannot be underestimated in terms of maintaining ideal body condition, but also improving insulin and glucose dynamics in the body. Maintaining appropriate nutrition, so even on a restricted diet, making sure the horse has adequate protein, vitamin and mineral levels is really critical to long-term body maintenance. And looking at lots of different management strategies, whether it is grazing muzzles, whether it is having to pen them up in a smaller space and then having some forced exercise in there, and get help to achieve the best outcomes. So, your veterinarian is certainly there to help, nutritionists are there to help, and they should be able to provide you with a holistic approach. So give you advice on some of these management strategies that are going to work for you in your individual situation, rather than just tell you what product to feed, and they should look at everything as a whole. Now, Equinews is a really, really good resource as well. There are literally thousands of articles on there which expand on all of the things that we have spoken about. So I would certainly encourage you to visit Equinews or sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. So with that, I think we've got a few questions that we are going to dive into. So Clarissa and David are both going to help me go through these because I've kind of had enough talking. So let's go with one for Clarissa first. So one that came in here is about an upper level dressage horse that's training Grand Prix that has equine metabolic syndrome, but she's very, very lazy and difficult to get some spark into. So usually with her other horse, Ariel adds in some grain strategically to give a bit of spark. But she's thinking now she can't really do that for this horse. So is there any way that you could suggest to get a bit more spark into her?
Yes, this is a really, really common question. And I think actually we got one very similar in the chat section during your talk, Beck.
Okay.
So in a lot of cases, these obese horses, which may or may not have insulin dysregulation, a lot of their laziness is genetic and not so much related to diet. So they've got these bigger horses have a slower metabolism, they burn their energy more slowly, and so they tend to be on the lazy side. So it's tricky with these horses because there's no magic ingredient or feed that's going to give them spark, and certainly with these horses with insulin dysregulation, you don't want to be giving them grain because that's just going to tip them over the edge. So the biggest thing with these guys is fitness and getting them super fit, making sure they have got enough energy in the tank in terms of what you're feeding them, but they need to be fit. So lots of different training methods like interval training, etc., and also timing of feeding when you're competing them. We don't want to be providing them with their feed within 4 hours of an exercise bout so that they've had a chance to clear that glucose and allow the energy to be stored. So we certainly don't recommend grain. And yeah, it's a really tricky one for these obese EMS horses and laziness because they do tend to be sluggish. So,
yeah, and I think it's a really good opportunity to look at individually. So for the guys that I see, there's a few actually questions like that. I think it's probably a good chance to get in touch with someone and run your entire diet through as well. We've got a question here that asks, how would you manage a insulin dysregulated horse or a horse with EMS and laminitis when they're a breeding horse, a brood mare?
Very carefully.
Do you want me to answer that or do you want to go with that, Dave? I'm not doing it.
Shoot.
Okay, so I guess with brood mares, they can get very fat. They are often out at good pasture, and so I guess if they are obese, I would work with your vet to get them diagnosed to see whether they had PPID or EMS or any sort of insulin dysregulation. Then work with your vet on any medications that might be required. And then the other thing is we know that exercise increases sensitivity to insulin. So if you can get the mares working, if you can get them on a track system or exercising, it's going to be fabulous for controlling their weight. And obviously not just feeding them all as a herd where they often get fed large amounts of high grain or large volumes of feed. Those obese mares need to be removed from that situation and have their nutrition controlled just like any other large overweight horse. So yeah, don't manage them as part of their herd. So control that NSC intake.
Yeah, perfect. So we've got a question. Oh, you go, David.
I think back with some of those horses that have got Cushing's, those potentially high-valued mares, if they're warm bloods or any breed that are able to ET or have surrogate foals, I think that may be an option as well just to reduce that stress during that pregnancy period.
Yeah, really good point. So we've got another question here, and I'm not going to go through all of these supplements because there's a list a mile long, but it's a really good question. And this one's from Amanda, and she asks, what is the efficacy of feed additives for EMS horses? There's lots of compounds that are touted for their benefits, but is there really data to support this? So just some of the ones that she's listed there are things like cinnamon and fenugreek, chromium, which we touched on a little bit, spirulina, fish oil, which we touched on, but there's a list a mile long there. So how do we actually wade through them and determine if there's actually a real benefit, not just marketing?
I think you've got to refer to the research, efficacy, dose. I mean, there is, as we've said, there's a little bit of research on the DHA, EPA, some chromium, some psyllium, but a lot of these essential oils were very new and novel to them. So whilst we shouldn't discount them fully yet, there's no research to actually evaluate what the dose and what the efficacy is of them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them may even have some benefit, but the amount that you would have to feed, it makes it prohibitive to study it and feed it in the as a sort of practical solution.
Yeah, good one. Any ideas on managing a PPID and insulin dysregulated horse in a colic-prone horse who cannot be fed long-stemmed hay? We're
lucky in Australia. We actually have chaff. If you talk to the Americans, chaff is new to an American. Chaff, hay cubes, beet pulp or super fibers, they can be an option. Obviously, we got to look at the dust aspects of those, so we soak that a little bit. But there are options out there.
And haylage and ensiled chaff products, speaking as a New Zealander.
Yes.
Of course.
We don't make very good haylage in Australia. We've got a question here. You guys yell out if you've got questions that you looked at whilst I was talking as well. But, we've got a question here about feeding linseed oil as an option instead of vegetable oil. And that's a good question because it's something that we actually get asked quite frequently, but the cost of linseed oil is prohibitive to be feeding it as an energy source. So, we can't really go down that route for that. And there's certainly more benefit if you're looking for the omega-3 point of view to be adding a fish oil in, as we chatted about, versus the ALA that is derived from our linseed oil, particularly for these horses that we do need the most biologically available active form so it can do the work that it needs to do. Yep. Did you guys have any other questions that you saw?
There's quite a few that have come through on the chat. Let me just quickly go through them. There's someone here Tracy said she has a couple of clients who are very much against feeding fish oil to their horses or any animal products. So whey, for example, is out as well. What are the alternatives for long chain fatty acids? And my immediate thought is, well, there's limited options for long chain fatty acids available in that ready to use form. So obviously in that situation, you probably would recommend flax oil. However, it is the shorter chain omega-3. There's some algae based. Yeah,
there's some algae based, but they're generally only either a DHA or an EPA.
DHA. Yeah, there's limited EPA in those, but that would be your other option. But again, cost-wise, probably pretty prohibitive. I know in human nutrition, they're pretty expensive supplements. So, and I don't think there's much of it. I don't know what country you're in, Tracy, but there's lots of, there's products available overseas, but in Australia, I haven't seen any algae-based horse supplements yet.
Yeah, for production animals, yes, they haven't marketed them to the equine specific.
Oh, so they're around. There you are. Talk to a production animal nutritionist. Here's one for you, David.
Right.
This is another one from Tracy. Thoughts on the bare bottle standard? So removing horses from pasture once it has been reduced to a bare bottle height. Bare, like bare.
Yep. Tracy's probably done some dairy nutrition because that's a a common phrase. So what we're talking about is getting the pasture to 4 to 6 inches. And once we get down to that, we take them off it. So basically what we're doing is ensuring that or trying to make sure that the horse isn't grazing that very sugar-rich pasture. So that's possible. The other, what we see more common, is that the horses will be grazing very, very short pasture, but they won't, their intake, and this will be higher in sugar, obviously, because it's in the growth phase. But since it's so short, the horse's intake would be quite lower. So there's two thoughts on that, but if you're able to do the beer bottle theory, that's a good option.
Right, next question. Some of these are very long. We might answer some of these individually. Oh, this was another one about the, wait, hang on, let's have a look here. Can fish oil DHA be effective in horses who cannot exercise due to pain during laminitic episodes? From Narelle, yes, because the research on glucose sensitivity improvement with long chain omega-3s is definitely worth considering when you've got a horse in that situation.
I've got a question here that I can see, maybe David, just really talking about some of those pros and cons of soaking hay, you know, and if it really is that worthwhile, or are you better trying to find and source a hay that is already low NSC?
I think if we're in that situation where we're managing that horse, even if we do have lowish NSC, or we think we've got low NSC pasture, or hay, sorry, I think soaking it is a good option. I mean, yes, it takes you a little bit of time, but you have to manage that horse. If you've got an EMS challenged horse, you need to go for the ride. You need to actually make sure that you're managing it the best you can. So a little bit of extra time here and there, I think it's worth it in the long run. And as you saw from a few of your slides, there's a significant amount of sugar that can be released from that hay by the soaking, yep, whether it be cool or hot water.
Yep, cool. Any other questions, guys, or are they all individual answers that we need to get back?
They're all individual. There's a couple of comments about muzzles damaging teeth, yeah, which can happen. It can also happen with slow feeder hay nets, with a horse constantly biting at the knots on the slow feeder hay net. And I think it's a tricky one, because you've got to sort of weigh up the benefits of reducing and controlling the intake versus the damage to the teeth. Obviously, teeth are pretty vital. So I don't really have an answer apart from finding a muzzle that doesn't necessarily have, you know, chunky bits for them to grab hold of underneath.
Yeah,
opposed to webbing.
I think risky constant monitoring of their teeth, because as they're eating or reduced eating with those grazing muzzles, their jaw sweeps is a lot shorter and sharper. So, I mean, maybe instead of, if you got your dentist once a year, maybe double it or triple it, just monitor them. If they get sharp edges, get them floated. Yeah.
I think there's a good question here, and it's kind of individual, but I'm not going to give the details, but it lends to the fact of giving a token feed. So it's an old pony with PPID and EMS that has had laminitis in the past and is currently having another laminitic episode, is on medication, soaked hay, and then a small amount of a fully fortified feed, but being fed below the recommended feeding intake rate. So all you're actually doing in that instance is contributing further calories to the diet and not actually hitting the mark on meeting those vitamin and mineral requirements. So you would certainly be best in that instance to take that fully fortified feed away and replace it with a balanced pellet, because you'll actually give the horse fewer calories but better overall nutrition. So I won't give further details details on that one, but that would be something that a lot of people do make an error on in giving this token feed to our horses.
Yeah, so although it's safe, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right choice of feed when you're feeding it below the recommended intake. And I think that was the question that just came through in the chat. All of these questions, if you've asked a question in the chat or in the Q&A box and we haven't answered it, we will contact you with an answer, just because they're probably linked to a very specific case that we can probably help you with if we can get a bit more information. So we'll be in touch on these. There's one more here from Narelle in South Australia saying that she's been soaking hay. It's time consuming and manual, which we totally understand. Doesn't appear to be helping the horse. TEF tested at 13.8% NSC, which is higher than our 10 to 12% that we recommend, plus Lucerne. Limited choice for low sugar hays in South Australia. Should she drop the TEF and just feed Lucerne? And I think
it's calories.
Sorry, yeah,
the calories from the Lucerne, yeah.
I would be trying very hard to find a low sugar alternative hay, which I know is obviously tricky, but there are meadow and pasture and grass mixes I know that are available that will be shipped to South Australia. And I feel like now that people are demanding and asking for hay tests, there should be more availability than just the TEF that a lot of people do rely on, because as you've pointed out here, Narelle, that's pretty high test for TEF, and I'm sure you can find something that's lower.
Yeah.
So I would say don't rely on don't rely on Lucerne. Try and find something else.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think everyone else does have quite specific ones. So everybody that has asked questions, I know we haven't got through them all, but we will contact you in the next couple of days and be able to help you with that. So David, is there anything else you wanted to go through?
No, I think we've covered everything. And obviously, as you guys said, we'll get back to everybody, but I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight and look forward to our next series of webinars that are coming up, and thank everybody that's been coming to our series throughout the year. I see quite a few frequent names there, and as you said in the past, we're gathering. We had questions from Spain tonight, all through Australasia, so it's fantastic that the reach that we're getting with these talks.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, guys. And yeah, feel free, get in touch with us if you do have any other questions as well. We'd be more than happy to help.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.